Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hi True Drews, and happy first day of August. I hope you all are excited about the mystery that we're going to be discussing on today's episode. That mystery is The Mystery of the Fire Dragon. So this is the 38th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it was first published in 1961. So I know I've said this about several of the book covers. I believe I said two of my favorite book covers are two of the editions from The Secret of the Old Attic. Like, that's my top of all the Nancy Drew books. But this is also in my top 10. It's just such a beautiful book cover. I've actually seen people make this cover into bookmarks, into purses, and it's on t-shirts, and it's just such a pretty cover. Now you're probably wondering, Avery, how do I see this book cover? You've probably seen it before and you probably know what I'm talking about, but if you want to see this cover for reference, I always post it on my Instagram on Wednesdays, the day before the podcast episodes air. And my Instagram, where you can check those out, is True Drew Podcast. So looking at this cover for The Mystery of the Fire Dragon, it's just gorgeous because we have this black night sky in the background and we can see these fireworks going off in the shape of a dragon, and Nancy is in the foreground and she's got the true red hair, this beautiful yellow, like sunshine yellow dress with a belt and a matching purse. Like, Nancy knows how to accessorize like no other. But then we've also got these people in the background, and so this mystery is very centered around China. So we get a whole picture of this mystery just from this cover. It's very accurate and it's just gorgeous to look at. So when it comes to a funny cover spoof, because I like to do these, I came up with, I'm generally so into a fireworks show. Get it? Generally so. I thought it was funny. And I gave this cover a rating of 5 magnifying glasses because it's just one of my favorites. It's so pretty to look at, and it's just in my top 10, probably in my top 5 actually. So now I'll go ahead and read some of the characters that we encounter in The Mystery of the Fire Dragon. And also, I apologize for how many times I said book cover or cover. Like, you could probably play a drinking game just with the first 2 minutes of this podcast. So some of the main characters in this book include Eloise Drew, Nancy's aunt, and her neighbor, Grandpa Soong, who also has a granddaughter, and her name is Chai Che. Or it might be Chai Che. I don't know. I'm so bad at pronouncing names, guys. I'm sorry. For the purpose of this podcast, I'm going to say Chai Che. I hope that I'm not butchering that. But then there's also Lee Soong, who is Grandpa Soong's twin, Lily Alice Wu, who is Chai Che's friend, Mr. Stromberg, who is a bookstore owner, Miss Horace Truesdale, who is a very annoying customer who comes up several times in this book, Ryle/Riley Moot, Ferdinand Breen, who's just described as a red-headed man, and Skinny Cord. Yes, this is an actual character's name, Skinny Cord. So without further ado, let's jump into the synopsis for The Mystery of the Fire Dragon. Nancy is reading a letter from Ned, who is studying in Hong Kong, when Carson teases that Nancy may find herself in the Far East sooner than she expects. Before he can elaborate, though, Aunt Eloise calls and says she has a mystery in New York. Her new neighbors, the Soongs, are very nice, but she is worried about Chai Che after she finds a note under her door saying the Soongs are in grave danger. Carson says he has a case in Hong Kong involving a will and estate, but tells Nancy he doesn't leave for a week so she can go to New York first. When the girls arrive at Aunt Eloise's, a firecracker goes off in the hallway. They also meet Grandpa Soong, who is under the impression that Chai Che is just off visiting friends. Not wishing to alarm him, Nancy instead chats with him about his book. Grandpa Soong comments that George strongly resembles his granddaughter. The next night, an assailant breaks in and attacks Mr. Soong and steals his manuscript, and the elderly man has to be taken to the hospital. Notes also keep showing up with a dragon in the bottom corner. Nancy decides to create a ruse by disguising George as Chai Che. George gets grabbed by a red-haired man on Columbia's campus who asks how she escaped, but then the man lets her go, realizing he's made a mistake. The girls give chase and end up in Chinatown. Nancy also follows the lead on the dragon stationery and learns more about the man named Ryle and possibly some smuggled jade. Lily Alice, a friend of Chai Chai's, takes over her job at the bookstore, and Nancy becomes convinced the store is a front after seeing a man come out of a trap door and having Mr. Stromberg yell at her and not let her purchase a certain book on Hong Kong. Bess is kidnapped from the grocery store, a firecracker explodes in Aunt Eloise's oven, Nancy is assaulted by a flower pot, and the girls are threatened that their plane to Hong Kong may have a bomb on it. Nancy also finds a bug at Aunt Eloise's apartment. Someone has been listening in to them, and everyone goes to Hong Kong, and the smuggling ring is closed in on. Chai Chai is found, and the bad guys are arrested after Nancy is kidnapped twice. Phew, that synopsis though, like how many people get kidnapped? Like Nancy gets kidnapped twice, Bess does, George almost gets kidnapped, Chai Chai gets kidnapped, like there's a lot of kidnappings. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with is Nancy Drew busts international mahjong smuggling ring, missing kidnapped girl returned to United States. I'm telling you guys, I'm struggling today. I don't know what it is with trying to pronounce things. I've been looking stuff up on Google. I was like, mahjong. Like I am horrible, so I apologize. So now we'll go ahead and jump into some of the direct quotes and notes that I took down for this book. So Ned is an exchange student in Hong Kong, and Nancy says he has learned some Cantonese in the first few pages of this book, and Carson comments this will make him valuable in a number of fields. And so I said, always looking out, Carson. I feel like Carson is just kind of silently sitting back and kind of judging anybody that Nancy dates, and he's like, you're acceptable, you're not acceptable, Dirk, tennis champion. But he's like, okay, Ned, you've learned Cantonese. That's a very valuable skill. Like, watch out, everybody. Ned Nickerson coming through. He's gone from insurance agent to camp counselor to international businessman. So we get another note on what time of year it is in this book. It's kind of cool when they do this in some of the books, but it says it's a crisp October evening because Nancy and Carson sit in front of a log fire. Like, I don't know about you, but I would love to sit in front of a fireplace with the Drews and just bounce around stories of all these mysteries they've solved. That'd be so fun. So when the girls get to Aunt Eloise's in New York, they see this man running away down the hallway, and then this firecracker goes off. So I was like, okay, yet another thing we can add to Nancy's near-death list. She almost got killed by a firecracker. I will say this, I am often jealous of all the trips and vacations that Nancy gets to take, but I am not jealous of the ways that she almost dies. It's a lot. So the next note that I have down is Grandpa Soong comments that George's hair and eyes strongly resemble Chai Chai. So there's kind of this delicate line that's played with throughout this book, like George resembles his granddaughter. So they dress George up quite a few times in order to lure out the villains. And so I don't see anything wrong with that. But if it was done in another way, it would be kind of offensive. But it's like, well, Grandpa Soong said it himself. But it's kind of this awkward thing they play with throughout the book. So Grandpa Soong is attacked and his manuscript is stolen, and it's all that he really says is it's about Hong Kong, but there's notes with this dragon in the corner that keeps showing up. Like Chai Chai, there's a note that Aunt Eloise finds that's written from her, and it has a dragon on the corner, and there's just all these notes keep kind of showing up, and so Nancy's starting to put two and two together. So Nancy and Bess dressed George up to look like Chai Chai, and I said, I don't really buy that George looks that much like her. Like maybe her hair and her coloring of her eyes, but nothing else. But apparently from a distance, with her hair styled the similar way, she is at least somewhat convincing. But I said it's kind of just like borderline offensive, you know? It's apparently convincing enough to the bad guys, though, because there's this red-haired guy on campus that grabs George and asks her, he says, Chai Chai, how did you escape? And then he realizes once he's got his hands on her shoulders that it's not her. And so he takes off and the girls give chase. And this was pretty funny, but their taxi driver said, what's going on here? You trying to date those guys? Like, of course, yes, we're trying to date these men. That's why we're chasing them in a taxi. And I think Nancy kind of just plays dumb and she's like, maybe. And she just doesn't answer the taxi driver's questions. But they find the car in Chinatown that the men were in, and so they report it to the police. So the next thing that I wrote down is George talks to Lily Alice Wu, and this is one of Chai-Chai's friends, and she convinces her to take over her old job at Stromberg's bookstore. So after a little bit of convincing, Lily Alice says she will, and Nancy asks her to look out for anything suspicious. Now, when we get back to Aunt Eloise's apartment, there's this whole scene where George sees that her travel clock has been knocked over, which the concept of bringing a travel clock is just so funny to me. Like, I get it, but now it's like we just use our phones. But it's been knocked over and in the floor, and they discover that someone was in the apartment and stole Chai-Chai's picture and the note that was supposedly left by her. So Aunt Eloise is a little bit freaked out about this. And they figure out that somebody who had a key to Grandpa Soong's apartment has been sneaking in through that connecting door because they're neighbors. They have this connecting door. And then this whole time, it's kind of sad, but Grandpa Soong is just at the hospital and he just thinks that his granddaughter is okay. She's just on a trip with friends. But he slowly starts to realize like something's wrong. So this next note that I took down is just crazy, but Aunt Eloise goes to put a casserole in the oven for dinner and another firecracker explodes. I feel like quoting Emerald Lagasse and just being like, bam, like this casserole is lit, it's on fire. Like how upsetting would it be to be putting some hamburger helper or something in the oven and it's just like, pow, 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 like just exploding and just like, also, what a mess. And then not to mention like second-degree burns. It's just bad. So, of course, they report this to the police, and all of the people in the apartment complex that Aunt Eloise lives in are super annoyed with them. But the police come, they check it out, and they're just like, well, okay, we'll just take note of this, I guess. And then they leave. But Nancy, after this, goes to the bookstore, Stromberg's bookstore, and Lily says she found Dragon stationery in a book on Hong Kong. So Nancy's just like, oh, light bulb, this is the same stationery that I keep seeing everywhere. So she tries to buy this book on Hong Kong, and Mr. Stromberg yells at her and won't let her. And shortly after that, Lily gets fired. So it's like, great, now our one connection at this bookstore is no longer there. Now, I have to apologize for this next thing because it's super racist, but George apparently is excited about the prospect of going to Hong Kong. So she says, me for Hong Kong. And I was just like, oh my gosh, George, like just, when in doubt, just shut up. Just keep your mouth shut. So the next thing that I wrote down is Bess gets kidnapped at the grocery store. She goes to shop for some more things to make dinner with because, their casserole exploded. And this woman and a red-haired man come up to her, and she's tied up and interrogated, and she feeds them a lot of half-truths. And then they dump her on the side of the road. And so she's like blindfolded, but she can tell she's close to the road because she hears these cars whizzing by. And this elderly couple finds her, and they think she's been hazed by a sorority, which is so crazy to me. But anyway, Bess just goes with it, and she gets dropped back off in town. I don't know, when anything happens to Bess in the books, it's just like my protection mode kicks in. I'm like, no, not Bess, please not Bess, because I love Bess. She's like one of the best characters in this series. So it's at this point in the mystery that Nancy goes back to the bookshop and she sneaks into Mr. Stromberg's office and hides under a desk. But she sees this man it's the man who tried to kidnap George, the red-haired man, and he goes in and out of a trap door in the floor. So Nancy's like, okay, this has got to be a front for something. This is not just a bookstore. So she chases the man, but he gets away, of course. The next thing that I took note of is that the girls are going to Hong Kong. So they're going to help Carson kind of solve his part of this mystery. And George says Bess should, quote, go on a diet or her huge appetite will scare Ned, Bert, and Dave. I was really starting to like George in some of these last few books, and then she just goes and says stuff like this all throughout this book. I'm just like, George, why? Why do you have to be like this? So everybody goes to Chinatown to eat dinner one night, and Nancy goes to investigate something across the street, and she has this flower pot dropped on her head. So yet again, with the head injuries, but it's the red-haired man that tried to kidnap George, Ferdinand Breen. So they do catch him. So they're slowly starting to close in on these members of this gang. So as if this mystery wasn't high stakes enough, we have people being kidnapped, we have firecrackers and exploding casseroles and all these things happening. Nancy's Aunt Eloise gets a threatening phone call saying that the girls' plane will blow up if they go to Hong Kong. So Nancy starts to suspect that they're being listened to. And she's telling Bess and George, she's like, I mean, that's the only thing that makes sense, right? Because these people are always 2 steps ahead of us and they know what we're doing. So she looks around in the apartment and she finds what looks like a bug on the windowsill of Aunt Eloise's kitchen window. So she tells Bess and George and Aunt Eloise to pretend like, oh yeah, we're not going to China, and they start talking about how they're not going to go to Hong Kong to fool the people listening to them. And then she snips the wire to the bug. So Nancy, Bess, and George get on the plane. They're still going to go, and they see Miss Harold Truesdale, the annoying customer that's always at the Stromberg bookshop, and she's like being so nosy and saying, why are you going to China? What are you doing? And Carson is also on the flight, but he doesn't talk to Nancy so as not to arouse suspicion. But they still have people come on board. They say, oh, there's been a bomb threat, and so they search the plane, but there is no bomb, and they're able to safely go to Hong Kong. It's crazy to me how the villains went to such extreme lengths in this book to keep them from going to China. But anyways, this flight actually stops in Alaska and then it stops in Japan before finally making it to Hong Kong. I was like, dang, that's a lot of stops. I mean, nowadays, you might have one layover. Thought that was interesting. So once they arrive safely in Hong Kong, Nancy sees Ned waiting for her at the airport, and it says a tingle of excitement rushed up and down Nancy's spine. So I was like, Nancy, now just last book you were over here flirting with Rick Larrabee. I think we all know that you really like Ned Nickerson. But the book says that Ned booked their hotel, and he says he got a suite in case Nancy wants to entertain any villains. And Nancy says, including yourself? And then Ned replies, call me anything you like, but just let me stick around. Like, what? Is that a come on? Because that sounded a lot like a come on. And also the fact that Nancy calls Ned a villain. Like, Nancy, are you saying that Ned has stolen your heart? Because I think that's what you're saying. So the next note that I took down is Nancy and Ned see Miss Truesdale, and she goes into Lung's mahjong shop. And apparently Lung stands for dragon. I don't know if this is right, but please, if someone out there speaks Cantonese, let me know. But anyway, Miss Truesdale orders some mahjong sets, but she drops a piece of paper with a dragon on it that says Com 10, and Ned says that that's the name of a city. So Nancy and Ned set off to go to the city, and they charter a helicopter, but Nancy gets tricked by someone at the airport when this girl comes up to Nancy and says, I'm Chai Che, and you need to get on this plane and come with me, and I'll tell you everything. But Nancy refuses at first, but then she decides, well, okay, I'll get on this plane, and then she's promptly captured and tied up by the fake Chai Che and then some guy named Skinny Cord. I'm sorry, but what kind of name is this, Skinny Cord? Like, my name is Shoelaces. Like, what a dumb name for a villain. But anyway. So Nancy's been kidnapped, and Ned slowly starts to realize, that she's disappeared. So he gets the airport authorities' help, and Nancy decides that she's going to take action. So she remembers that she has some lipstick, in her pocket or in her purse. So even though she's tied up, she is able to get that lipstick out and unroll it and get it out. And then she writes SOS backwards on the plane window. Has there ever been a better use of makeup? I'll wait. Maybe she's been kidnapped. Maybe it's Maybelline. So basically Ned and the airport authority and these 4 fighter jets are maneuvering around this plane, and they're trying not to crash it, but they are able to make them land, and they're able to get Nancy back to safety. But oh my gosh, it was a lot of adrenaline in that chapter. So the next note that I have down is, meanwhile, Bess and George have been trailing Miss Truesdale because Nancy asked them to, and they all run into each other at the same floating restaurant. So they're able to have a nice dinner. So I was like, finally some peace amidst all this chaos. So this next note is just interesting from a world history kind of standpoint, but Ned mentions that the Hong Kong island is run by the British, and after doing some basic research, I see that ended in 1997. They declared, I guess, their own version of independence. So just kind of interesting to read these books because they're so dated as far as they were last revised in the 70s, so a lot's happened since then. So the next thing that I wrote down is everyone works with Lee Soong, who is Grandpa Soong's twin, and he works for the police department in Hong Kong. But George is again asked to impersonate Chai Che at this garden party, and Miss Truesdale sees her and screams, "Chai-Che, you got off the junk!" So now they know that she's being held on a boat in the harbor. So it's at this point when Nancy gets kidnapped again, and she gets thrown onto the same boat that Chai-Che is on, and she's told about the smuggling ring, putting gold and ivory in these mahjong sets, and the girls jump overboard and escape, and the bad guys are captured. So all's well that ends well. We finally have captured all these smugglers, we've captured the kidnappers, and more importantly, Chai-Che can be reunited with her grandfather. So that concludes all of my notes for this episode, but now we're going to jump into the What's Cookin' segment of the podcast. So up first, I said Aunt Eloise's explosive casserole. We don't ever hear what that was made of, but I'm sure it was all over the walls of that kitchen. We also see in the book that the girls get to enjoy Peking duck, bean sprouts, and bird's nest soup. And then there's also bacon and cucumber soup, stewed shrimp, sweet and sour pork, beef fried in oyster sauce, bamboo shoots, rice, and almond tea. Now, for the add that to your resume section, I said that Nancy could add that she's a missing persons locator. She never stopped in her quest to find Chai-Che, so I thought that that was worthy of adding to her resume. I also said that Nancy could be a wiretap detector because she easily figured out that someone was listening in on them at Aunt Eloise's. And Nancy's a makeup marvel and backwards alphabet expert. I mean, granted, SOS is not that hard to write backwards. There's definitely harder things to write backwards, but that's a pretty cool skill. Now we'll discuss the things that I liked and the things that I didn't like about the mystery of the fire dragon. So I loved the fact that we got to go to China. I thought that was really neat. And I also liked that the kidnapping just was a big central part of this book. There were a lot of high stakes in this one. But as far as things I didn't like, I said some parts felt a little thrown together, and then there was a point in this book where Chai-Che's kidnapping seemed to kind of take a back seat, which I didn't really like. But also, George dressing as Chai-Che, there's a few kind of problematic things with this book, and those were things I didn't like. So I gave this book a rating of 3 magnifying glasses. I feel like that's such a middle of the ground kind of rating, but I find that a lot of the books easily fall into that because, I mean, it wasn't a horrible book, and usually that'll bump it down to a 1 or a 2, but it wasn't a great book, so that doesn't bump it up to a 4 or a 5. So yeah, that concludes today's episode for The Mystery of the Fire Dragon. I hope you guys liked it, and if you've been enjoying this podcast, if you want to leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I would really appreciate it. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the clue of the dancing puppet. So if you like people who talk in Shakespearean sonnets all the time, old Callie boy, or you like dancing puppets, this is the one for you. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.